I'm very pleased to be able to speak today with Yngve Slyngstad, the Executive Director of the Norway Bank Investment Management, also sometimes called the Oil Fund, one of the world's largest sovereign wealth funds, $455 billion in investable assets invested globally. Thank you very much for speaking to us today. Give us a sense of where you were in January of this year and where you are today. And what was it like in January when your fund was, way down, and I think that your own salary was actually cut, and basically there were lots of calls, for there to be a revamp in the way in which the fund was administered. Did you think that in that period some of the criticisms hurled at your fund were valid, or were you just a victim of the market as it was at that point in time?
Well, we presented our annual report on the 11th of March, and that was the day after the markets bottomed out in the rest of the world, and 2 days after in the US, right? So that was about the worst time of the whole crisis with regards to the market returns. So it was considerably pressure, and there's a lot of media debate about investment strategy. But I think through this whole crisis, and with the support of the Norwegian political establishment, the fund management model and the whole idea of setting aside this money for the next 2 generations was never questioned. And also I think the outcome of this whole crisis for us is probably that we got through this now without any losses, and support for the model among the Norwegian population and among the politicians and the public at large is probably stronger than it ever has been.
Would you say that as far as funds that are invested for the long term, 30 years horizon that you have, and compared to other sovereign wealth funds, that your investment philosophy is somewhat simplistic because you basically are mandated to invest only in equities and fixed income, basically. So you're a fund manager, as opposed to other sovereign wealth funds which are invested more broadly, and maybe even private equity type players in the marketplace. Is there a thinking in the government that you should be much more sophisticated, or take more than just an equity stake in the investments that you make?
Well, it's up to us as a manager to suggest the asset allocation to the ministry. I think the fundamental thing you're starting with is really in asset allocation is how much do you want to be an owner and how much do you want to be a lender. Now we have an equity holding of 62%. So that is kind of where you are, and then you can discuss what you want to own and what you want to lend to. But the first primary allocation decision is really that one. And that has to be somehow correlated to what kind of risk capacity or risk tolerance your client has in the final lender. I don't necessarily think that equity risk premium of sitting on public listed equities is different from private equities or from real estate assets or other alternatives. On the contrary, quite simply the fact that it's listed means that it swings quite dramatically, and therefore you maybe get compensated even more for having that kind of liquid asset class. So through the first 10 years of the fund's history, and we're now 11 years into it, we've always been kind of a bit skeptical to the alternative asset class and the idea behind it. It was supposed to pick up a liquidity premium. What the liquidity crisis of 2007-2008 showed was that maybe that liquidity wasn't priced well enough. One sense is probably of this that now it may make more sense going forward to invest in less liquid asset classes, because you probably should get compensated more healthy for that liquidity.
But the skill sets that you seem to be putting in place within the organization seems to be very, seem to be tending towards fund manager, equity type investments, rather than, going deeper as you suggest in that way. I mean, the management team that you have in place, the background that they come with, and they seem to be essentially fund managers.
No, I think that's a right observation. As an investor, we portray ourselves first of all as a pure fund manager, and our first target is to beat the benchmark. However, we do have responsibility for the absolute return of the fund also through our advisory role and our suggestion on asset allocation.
Give us a sense of your activism, or in the markets that you operate. I think that the fact that you are now the holder of 1% of global equities, nearly 2% of European equities, makes you a formidable player, and a position that maybe would have been played by American fund managers like Calpers, the pension fund and so on. How do you play that role, and what's the motivation with which you go to market in terms of what you like to see happening in terms of ethical performances and so on?
Yes. With regards to our dialogue with the companies, we always want to be very clear that we're on the side of the company. Right? We're not an antagonistic shareholder who wants necessarily to change things. We're supporting the company as they build their business. Now, what we think is important for the long-term return of the fund is that we have good corporate governance standards in all companies we're invested in globally. So the kind of corporate governance standards that we try to communicate to the companies that we would like to see is the same no matter where in the world we are. It is simple things like the division of the roles between chairman and CEO, the equal treatment of minority shareholders, one share, one vote, no dual asset, no dual share classes, etc. But we think these principles are quite important to make first a global equal playing field, but secondly also to make the return on our fund long-term good.
How transparent and how quickly do you put your principles out on the table before you make an investment? So do you have management meetings with the organizations that you're investing in and lay out the principles that you like them to meet, or do you go in, take a stake, and then sort of try to make a difference?
We are broadly invested in quite a few companies. So during a year like 2009, we will have more than 2,000 meetings with the CEOs and CFOs of the companies. So it's a continuous dialogue that we always will be having with the companies.
The financial services industry, you are somewhat heavily weighted in financial services and in the global institutions like HSBC and so on. And right now, the fund managers who are heavy weighted in financial services are trying to influence the shape of the industry. If I were to ask you, what are some of the top of mind issues that you have with financial services that you'd like to see happening as a result of the aftermath of the current crisis, what would they be?
Well, I think it's a fundamental question of the business models of quite a few financial institutions going forward. A simple thing like banks now having to fund themselves in the bond market at a higher interest rate than quite a few of the clients they're lending to is, of course, a substantial issue going forward. So retail banking seems to be quite healthy, although you have this housing crisis. The commercial lending we're a bit more uncertain about. Now, of course, how is this all going to solve out with the new regulation coming in place also? So investing in the financial industry for the moment is a very uncertain proposition. On one side, we've got huge earnings coming in, but there is uncertainty around the business model going forward.
Given the fact that Warren Buffett is, made a huge bet back into America, give us a sense of your sense of the future of the U.S. as an economy and as a destination for investable assets.
We're not one of those institutions that's skeptical to U.S. It's shown over time that the U.S. has had that amazing ability to come back very strongly. If you go back a generation, or say 20 years ago, it was consensus that Japan would grow 4% a year and the US around 0, and that didn't develop during the last 2 decades at all. So I think now also, we will be quite careful about making early predictions of the lack of regeneration in the US.